Okay, good morning, everybody. Let me make sure all my feeds are up. It looks like they are. Okay. Good morning. My name is Samantha Mirabal with Melco's application team, and we're live both on Facebook and YouTube to answer whatever questions you might have on about DesignShop, digitizing, pretty much whatever you want to talk about. Um, we'll get that covered. I do have a few questions that were asked ahead of time. If you have questions while we're going along, type them in on the feed, both on the little chat part on both Facebook and YouTube. I'll bounce back and forth between the platforms to make sure I'm getting any questions answered. But for that, so if you see me looking off to the side, that's what I'm doing. I keep a second monitor up over there with all my questions. Hi, Rick from Vancouver. Welcome. All right, so let's see what we have. So first question was, I'd like to know how to run a single line satin stitch around the edge of a complex design consisting of a bunch of different layers. Okay, that one's fun. So let's go over to Design Shop, close the mess I was making earlier. And let's see. I've got some complex designs, and how I would do this, you can trace around it, which that's the slow way to do it. There's a way quicker way, particularly with the 11. So if you select your design, you come up to Object, Generate Basting or Primer Stitch, change the basting to primer, and from here, you can, however far away from the design you want your thing to be. So I'm going to change this to be offset of 30 points. You can make it be whatever you want. And I'm going to say, okay. So what that'll do is it'll create basically a basting stitch, which is not what I want, or a primer stitch, but that gives me the shape. Now that I have the shape, oh, I did something quick. So I clicked on one of those because I don't need to do that crosshatch pattern. I just want one of the shapes. So I selected it over my tree over here and I hit the delete key on my keyboard. Now from there, I can take this one complex and convert it to a single line. So how do you do that? There's a few different ways. I can just click on it, hold my control key on the keyboard, which means convert, change element type, and click on single line center, and poof, I got a single line center evenly spaced around my design. Okay, then from there you can make the width wider, whatever you want to do. You can do at that point from your single line. Okay, so that was one way to do that. So if I undo that, so that was holding control. Another way is to, again, select the shape. Right here, this is change element from one type to another. I can go, all right, make that a single line center. Do I want to add it? So basically, do I want to leave that fill or do I want to replace that fill? I want to replace it, so click on replace. That's the same thing as control click. Okay, so that will give me a single line, and you'll see that works with all kinds of complex designs. So if I take this guy, again, select the design, go to Object, Generate Basting, Primer Stitch, change it to a primer. You can leave it at the default. If you want it to be further away, you can make it closer. Again, I usually just delete one of those because I don't need it. Hold the control key and then click on the single line, and that'll change that from a fill to a single line center that follows the contour. Now that 50 points is how far away from the shape you want it to be. So if you want it closer, make that number smaller. Make it 20, 30, whatever you want. Okay. So that's that first question. We do have one typed in. How do you curve the text for the back of hats? So I don't have the templates on this computer, but basically what you'd want to do, there's a few different ways you can do it. I am really I don't tend to keep templates of the different hat files and whatnot. So what I end up doing most of the time is hooping it so it's nice and flat. So I usually take a round circle and just hoop the hat and take a picture with my trusty phone straight down on it. What that gives me then is something that I can trace along. I know there are a bunch of people who've actually created little arc templates that match the different hats. So you just have to figure out which arch matches that particular hat that you're going to sew on. Like I said, I tend to do it with my phone and then import the picture. So from there, you would have a picture on your screen. I'm just going to draw a circle that has your hat drawn, and then you'll see the arch of that, where the cutout on the back is. So from there, you would just type your text, and you can either measure the radius or do, like I said, I tend to be lazy about it. So rather than actually measuring it, I will tend to come into this, change it to be arc, and then move it around until it follows the shape that I want around the back of the hat. That's just how I do it. Like I said, there are plenty of templates out there that actually have all those curves built in. So, did I lose internet? Nope. Okay. So that's one suggestion I'd have, is you can either download those templates or just take a picture of it and make it curve along what you want. Okay. So what other questions do we have? All right, so we covered that one. The next one was, how do I erase the lines that show in a design but not in the wireframe point? So these connector lines is what we're asking about at this point. So those things are done. Let me go open up my little file that I created beforehand. So I took your picture, since I didn't have the actual design. So I took your picture and I traced it just to get those connector stitches there so we could see about how to deal with them. So first off, there's one way to deal with it, which is not a very good way, but you can come into properties, and what's driving those are your settings here and where your starts and stops are. So you can of course come in here and change it to be something weird, something small, and it'll get rid of them. But I would argue that's not the best way to handle this, because that adds trims between all your elements, which when you're sewing something like this, there's no reason to have all those trims. All right, so another way, rather than going and changing your tie-in and tie-out properties, is let's fix the real issue. Let's deal with where the starts and stops are. So, and because that's what's creating them. So it's creating those stitches from where one element ends. So here's one of them, right? So that propeller you see right here is where your previous element ended. Okay, so that white propeller is where the element right above it ended. The green circle is where the element that's selected is going to start. So if your distance from where the propeller is to where it's going to start is shorter than that number in the property box under your tie-in and tie-outs, that auto trim 64, then it's going to just leave that connector stitch. So how do we fix this? Well, if you move your start point near where the stop is, that will get rid of that first connector that was under there. All right, so where's the second one coming from? So again, this element ended where the propeller is, and it starts over here, so that's not it. Ah, there it is. So we end here, and it starts over here. So it's doing that connector stitch. Well, I need the start to be closer to that. I can't move this one because my element is this tiny thing. So really how you want to deal with this is to rearrange your elements so that you can optimize your starts and stops. So for instance, I have this one, starts and stops. Well, okay, now I've got this one. Let's make it start and stop over here. Rather than moving the X, I could just select the element, click on my start and stop, say start here, stop there. That's cute. Next element. Well, I want to start near that propeller. So again, click on the element, change my start to my stop, and there is one last connector. That one you're not really going to notice. But again, you can rearrange this by just changing your elements and playing with your starts and stops. And hi Scott, and by putting those starts and stops close together, that's going to minimize those size of those jump stitches, those connectors, and it'll keep your design moving faster, or when it goes to sew, it'll keep your machine running at a higher speed without all those extra trims. So it's really just a matter of paying attention to your starts and stop and making sure your green circle is near your white propeller, which is where the previous element ended, and that means it'll just keep on sewing. All right, so that's how I would deal with those, is go rearrange your elements or change your starts and stops, and that will make them go away. Now, like I said, you could do it by changing your tie-in and tie-off auto trim property to be a small number, but then you're going to have trims mid something like this, and there's no reason to have trims on an element like this. I mean, this guy's tiny as it is. You had it at 0.18, I think, wide. So that's what I tried to keep this close to, just so you could see. And, you know, there's no reason on something that small that you have a bunch of trims. Okay, what other questions do we have? So I don't see any typed in, so I'm going to come back to my ones that were asked ahead of time. So that's how, like you could see here, it ended here and it started here, which is why there's that connector stitch right there. Okay, so by making that green circle be near that white propeller, that particular connector stitch will go away. All right, what else do we have? I'm ready to remove all traces of V10 from my desktop. I see it all over the place. Basically, you're asking how to get rid of it. What I would suggest is you have V11 now, so which means you also have tech support. I honestly would just call tech support and tell them you want to remove V10 from there, and they know all the little spots of where it's hidden in the registries and all the different folders, and they can go clean it out for you just by logging into your computer and click, 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 and it's done. That would be my suggestion and probably be the quickest way to get it gone, rather than you plinking around finding them all. So that's where I would start. Is just call tech support and let them log in and do it. This one, I booted up my computer a couple of days ago and now it says light, but that's not what it was. All right, so if you're going between, I assume that means you have a physical dongle, because that's the only time it's when a dongle's removed, it's going to pop up as light. So what you'll want to do is either reboot your computer, make sure your dongles are nicely plugged in, that everything's connected, because if your dongles are all in and you turn it on, then it will pop up into the version you have. Which the duplication part, that's also because it's in light. So it works different than the full version of it. So you'll want to, get your hotkey thingy registered on there. I don't know. Are they called dongles? The security key. It's the little thing that looks like a USB drive, but it's Sentinel or whatever. Those are what I call dongles. All right. Creating custom decorative stitches. I've made one, but it doesn't bend around curves or points properly. Is there some specific setting, or is it in the way it's digitized? So it's in the way it's digitized, and there is no warp, right? So when you're doing your decoratives, whatever shape you draw, all right, that's a bad decorative because my start and stop are not on the same line. But it's going to take this shape and repeat it starting at, along your line right here. So it's going to boil down to which way you're curving. So sometimes if you're, for instance, think about a scallop, right? So actually I'll draw it on the screen. So if I've got a scallop, and again, I did not pay attention to my start and stop. Let's move it. All right, so that's closer to being on the same line, right? So if I've got a scallop and how it's going, and I draw my decorative so it's curving that way, it's going to work out and look just fine because of how this is drawn, and we want it to be hard points, and it's going to trace along the curve, right? Whereas if it's going the opposite direction, when I go to digitize it, it's going to be on the inside. So that at that point, rather than fanning out nicely, all your curves are going to get closer together and start intersecting depending on how tight your curves are. So it really, when you're trying to make it bend around curves nicely, the things you got to think about, which direction are you going to be digitizing it? Do you need to make one going clockwise and then another decorative going counterclockwise? So that's one consideration. Another is the smaller the element is, the less you're going to notice the fact that it's connecting one point to another. It's kind of like you can't thread going from needle penetration to needle penetration. That thread's going to be a straight line regardless because it's a physical piece of thread being dragged, right? So there is no curving that thread unless you add more points. So the smaller it is, the more likely it's going to look clean around the curve. So these curved type elements are going to look better around curves. Having smaller things are going to look better around curves. Paying attention to which direction you're going to digitize it. But I mean, it really boils down to you're going to have to do the work around it. You're going to have to digitize it, test it, see how it works, go again. So it's really, working through that. Now we did have a similar type question about e-stitches. So e-stitches, so the question here was, all right, I drew a single line. So I've got an e-stitch. Sometimes it's on the inside, and let's make it go the opposite direction. Oh, not edge fill. E-stitch. There we go. And sometimes it's on the outside, right? So sometimes it comes in, sometimes it goes out. You know, is there a way to flip that easily so it goes, you know, this one goes in or that one goes out? No. So once it's there, that you have to repunch it. Or if it's a closed shape, so that it goes on the outside when you're digitizing counterclockwise, it goes on the inside when you're going clockwise, right? So if I go counterclockwise, draw myself a shape, and hold Shift on my keyboard and Enter to close the shape, and then I'm going to hit Enter to accept the default width. All right, so that's on the outside. So when it's on the outside, DesignShop prefers things going clockwise in general. So if you want it to go from outside to inside, I can show you kind of a workaround to fix that. But going from inside to out, there's no way to do that short of repunching it. So what you can do for this one is I can convert it to a fill. All right, so how do I do that? I can either select the shape, click on this thing right here, change element from one type to another, convert it to a fill, hit replace. Now, this is going to sound silly, but just follow me for a minute. If I just draw another fill on top of it and combine it, so select both of these shapes and say combine, it's going to recalculate that from, instead of being counterclockwise, it goes to clockwise. So now if I were to convert this over into an e-stitch, so again, select the shape, make it a single line, place it, and it's back to the e-stitch. Now it's on the inside rather than the outside. So you can force the issue from an out, you know, have it facing out like this to in, but there's no way to force it from in to out short of repunching it. And to do that, you just go counterclockwise when you're punching. Okay. Let's see. All right, so that was the e-stitch question, which, all right, we talked about the bending. This was the e-stitch. So other than redrawing, is there a way? Only if you want it to go from outside to inside. Going from inside to out, not a thing at the moment anyway. So this one was interesting. You know, why is it every time I call tech support, the first thing they want to do is go into my computer and change all the settings? Well, you know, your active feed settings are going to play a big role into how you sew something, right? So if I'm sewing on a towel versus a hat versus a linen handkerchief, if I'm sewing with a cutaway versus a tearaway, something really thick to really thin, my settings are going to vary. So it's always a good idea to, when we're troubleshooting, is to start, what I always like to say, start with the obvious, right? So check, you know, is the machine threaded right, your bobbin right? And personally, I start with checking settings as well, even on my own equipment if I'm trying to work through something. So it's always a good idea to start with settings and then work out from there. So a few tips that you can have is if you've called tech support and let's say you are working with someone, you're working with Mark or Curtis or, you know, whoever you're working with. You get off the phone, you try what they did, you run some things, and it's still not working exactly how you want. You call back. Well, it's always, you can always ask for the same person again, right? So you can say, hey, I was working with Mark. I'd like to work with him some more to kind of finish working on this. So rather than the next technician going through and tweaking things, you can work with whoever worked with you to begin with and kind of dial in a little bit more. So there's always that as an option. But, you know, it's always, you know, all the machines are going to run just a, you know, there's so many variables. What the material you're sewing on, what's backing, how you're hooping, you know, your different settings on your thread break sensor. All of that plays a role into what activate, even what software you're running. V11 has different activate settings versus V10. So that's why you're going to start with settings and then start with settings, start with needles and the basics, and kind of work up from there. That's kind of why. But yeah, you can a good tip though is whenever, if you're working with someone in particular, get their name, and if you got to call back, ask to speak to the same technician. That way you can kind of work and continue along the thread chain that you had already been working with them on. Okay. All right. Let's see. Any other questions? I don't see any on YouTube, and I don't see any others on Facebook. Let's see. And I think that was all the pre-canned questions I had. I did not show, I think I show it every week. I didn't show how to actually create the decorative. So let me quick do that just in case. So let's say you want to make this a decorative stitch. All right, so first and foremost, you need to make sure your starts and stops are on the same line. So that is quite important to making sure things don't drift and all of that fun stuff. So I usually just turn on the grid and get it close. If I were doing this one as a real one, I'd want to actually pay attention to my points down here and make sure they're the same. But from here, I can go Save Custom Shape. You'll find I love to type this in as test. That way I'm not creating a bunch of junk within my database until I'm happy with it. Okay, so I'll type in test, decorative, yes, I want to replace it. And then I will go test it and see, did that do what I wanted it to do? Do I like it? Do I not? Do I need to make edits to it? So I'll draw whatever I want, and there's my little decorative, very simple one. But so I can test it out, see if that gives me the look I want. If I'm happy with it, great. If not, I go, I need to tweak it. Go into your shape and tweak it. Rewrite your test and go again. Okay. Let's see. MK on YouTube, same with OS. I missed where that question was asked. So OS, as far as the act feed settings, yeah, you would want to, it depends on what machine, what software, all of that. If that's what you're asking, I apologize. I didn't see when that question popped up what I was talking about. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. Anything else? I'll kind of stall a little bit. I know we've been watching Olympics a ton around our household. It blows my mind how fast, like the walk, they had the 50K walk. These people were doing like a 7-minute mile walking. Sorry, that just blew my mind. I can't run a 7-minute mile at my hardest, let alone walk it. So, oh, what else? The marathons today. I'm excited about that. I run marathons. All right, run is a little bit odd, but for me, it's my version of running. All right, well, I don't see any other questions typed in, so I guess we will call it a day until next week. Next week, I think I'm going to be back on Friday as well, so we'll see what questions we have. And so, yeah, it's the same with OS. All right. So I'll be back next week to answer whatever questions you have. Again, remember, type them in on the comments, and I'll ask probably next Wednesday or Thursday. I'll be polling for questions again in some of the Facebook forums. You can always email applications@melco.com, and we'll try to get your questions put into our session. All right. You guys have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you next week. Bye, guys.